So here I am again with you, Colin, to talk about one of these never-ending projects that we seem to get involved in. And this is another unboxing video, kind of. This time it's about Bert Jansch live at the BBC.
Indeed it is, yeah.
Well, it's not all live at the BBC. It is all live at the BBC, is it?
It's all either live at the BBC or live in various places that the BBC were there recording at.
And this was another one of these huge remastering projects that you tricked me into.
Well, what by saying would you like to do a Bert Jansch live at the BBC project?
Yeah, you said it'd take you half a day. This one ran to, I think we did this over the course of how long?
It did stretch. It was a project that did stretch for various reasons. Some behind the scenes.
I think you said half a week. I think it was about 1.5 years. This one, was it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
To be honest,
whenever you say weeks, I hear years now in these projects. Anyway,
yes. I think there was a number of reasons why it stretched, and to be honest, I've forgotten most of them. I think lockdown had something to do with it, in that I think it was projected that it might be ready at a certain point, and the fact that the industry was affected by lockdown as much as anything else, I think. But you know what? Ultimately, even though it was a bit, it did seem to become very laborious and painstaking and kind of painful at times.
Only for me.
Yes. I think ultimately, ironically, the whatever the delays were about, it did actually benefit the set, in that a few things came to light fairly late in the day.
Exactly, and you're able to reassess where stuff sat in the canon and stuff.
Yeah.
Just to give a bit of a background, I got this a while ago, and I haven't even opened it yet. So I'm looking forward to opening it on camera today.
Yeah. I was very kindly sent 2 sets by the label. One, the 8 CD set, and one, the compressed 4 LP version, which comes with a download for anybody who purchased it of the other tracks. So I've brought along the vinyl set.
Brilliant. We'll look at that. But let's just to go back on how the first time I got involved with you in this artist's music was back in probably 2005, 6,
2007, I think.
When we remastered everything that we could find of Pentangle.
Well, no, it wasn't quite everything.
Well, as I said to you, in the event of a nuclear holocaust, the only things surviving on Earth would be cockroaches and unreleased Pentangle tracks. that would keep turning up, and you would keep putting in the project for us. But this was a terrific kind of a compendium of a lot of Pentangles.
Well, that was actually back in the day of this is a long box. This is a book set, as it were. I think is a 4 CD set with a long essay. It's about the essay is actually about half the length that it had been, I think.
But it was a great project.
A fair amount of editing went on.
Yeah, and there was a lot of stuff came from very different sources. Anyway, that was where we started our relationship with, this music started.
I mean, as a general note, back in the 2000s, this came out in 2007, and actually at the time the band were presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award by David Attenborough, no less, at the Radio 2 Folk Awards that year, and I was there hiding behind a pillar in case any members of the Pentangle saw me. Our relationship is that good.
You were disguised as a mountain gorilla, weren't you?
That's right. Yeah, unfortunately.
But everybody thought this was just in place, so nobody was out with David's.
Attenborough, look, yeah. No, back in the day, in the 2000s, it was still the era where box sets would tend to be 4 or 5 disc sets featuring a kind of a best of, plus
Unseen,
plus a bunch of bits and pieces. So not the kind of humongous efforts they are today. Today, the box set has evolved to be kind of complete works.
Yes.
To be somebody's complete
retrospective of as much as you can find.
Yes, everything and more.
Well, I remember that was a short one of your projects. I think I remember that one. You said that one would take 2 weeks. I think. Probably about 9 months. That one was it?
I you know what? I actually can't remember.
Oh, I can. But it was great. It was great. It was a great project to be involved in, and actually it was very well received. So I'm sure you were very happy about that. So
listen, it was a bit fraught towards the end, and some opinions by some band members spilled out into the into the press, so that there was just it was a fraught process, and I don't even want to go into that. There were disagreements, and it spilled out into the public, and it's a matter of public record. But that's fine. I stepped away from working on anything to do with the Pentangle or Bert Jansch at that point. I thought, life's too short for that kind of rancor. I was actually sort of drawn back in a number of years later. This came out in 2013. And this is Jan Lehman's Acoustic Roots soundtrack. Now, this was a documentary made by Jan for BBC Scotland, shown on BBC Two in 1993, of Bert Jansch as the central figure in a documentary about British acoustic music in the 60s. So a number of great people, Anne Briggs, Wiz Jones, Davy Graham, Al Stewart, and so forth, appeared in this with Bert, and I was at a couple of the filming sessions at the time, and I did the sleeve note for the soundtrack album that came out in 1993. And in 2013, Jan got in touch with me saying he was going to revisit this. He was going to do an enhanced DVD, an enhanced soundtrack, and would I like to refresh the booklet notes? So I did, and that was the first thing I did after 7 or 8 years away from working on Jansch or Pentangle projects, and since then, other things happened. Other people contacted me to, do this or that similar thing, like updating notes and so on, including Earth Records, who deal with the Jansch estate quite a lot these days. And Alex from Earth had contacted me to, asking would I like to refresh some notes for a reissue of Bert's Avocet album, which I did. It's fine. And there was 2 or 3 other things like that. So gradually, I got to a place where I was happy to keep, to do what I could to keep Bert's legacy alive, because Bert had passed on in the interim.
It'd be fair to say you're the ultimate Bert fan.
Yeah. Ultimately, yes, I'm a fan. I mean, back in the 80s when everybody else was, watching Top of the Pops, I was rummaging around Smithfield Market trying to find old Bert Jansch albums,
Well, so look, I haven't actually opened this, so I'm going to open this now. Will you talk me through what we're about to find? If I find some keys to open this, it's a bad thing in a box set whenever you can't
get into it.
Yeah. So maybe you talk us through what is in here, and I'll try and get it opened in the meantime.
Well, I can't remember who'd come up with the idea. I think possibly after doing being involved in a number of projects with Alex at Earth in a very semi-detached sort of way.
Do you have any keys on you?
Actually, I don't.
I found something. Here we go. Right, so I'm keying the Bert Jansch box set. Okay, yeah. So what
Bert, actually, back in the day, Bert used to do a version of Big Bill Broonzy's Key to the Highway. Now we need a key to the box set, don't we?
Well, here we go. Yeah. So, very good. So here we go. Finally, so this has been sitting in the house for a couple of weeks, I think, maybe more. And from when we finished this, it's been about a year
and a half, I think.
About a year and a half.
Funny feeling we finished it towards the end of 2021.
Yeah.
And I think there was, because of the nature of vinyl production, I think I'm right in saying the label couldn't. There was going to be a long delay in getting the vinyl version, which is this one, done, and they wanted to release both at the same time.
Lovely.
So there's the vinyl version. That's what happens there. This is going to probably horrify people. Oh no, I'm not touching the vinyl itself. There you go. So yeah, it's a lovely package.
So two versions you can buy. So this is the CD one, obviously.
Because of the delay in the production of vinyl these days, it's a 7 or 8 months lead-in time.
Who would have guessed that at this stage, actually, you can get CDs made at the drop of a hat, but vinyl is a real. They're actually opening new plants in England, I think, to cope with the capacity.
There's one just behind you.
Oh God.
Well, so because of that, the label, they wanted both to come out at the same time, which is quite right, and therefore it was delayed until I think about October last year.
Right, okay.
something like that. So look, it was a long time coming, but I think they did a great job. You know, the Alex's
and as always with these box sets, there will be
it's
a beautiful design, but as always with these things, will be a few short words from you about his legacy.
Again, I say again because people watching this may not know that we've just filmed half an hour's worth of an unboxing video for something else. But again, what you're seeing in there is about half of what was written. Right. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's because what is in there is probably enough. But there was.
And so, what is the content of this that does describe the circumstances and the times in Bert's life whenever the music was recorded, or the nature of the recordings?
Well, actually, the pages you're on there, Bert Jansch remembered by his collaborators. One of the great fun parts of this set for me was going back and interviewing a number of people that I interviewed for his biography in 1999-2000. Who are featured on this set, the likes of Rod Clements and Nigel Portman-Smith and Peter Kirtley and Jackie McShee and so on. In some cases I interviewed people and transcribed it. In some cases people like Ralph McTell and Jackie McShee, I think they created their own text and emailed it. So these are testimonials about people remembering working with Bert. And I was also able to go...
Well, I'm looking here at Johnny Marr has provided, and Bernard Butler.
Yes.
And Bob Harris.
Yeah, Mary Hopkins. Now, with Bob Harris, etc., you're getting into the next set of testimonials, and that's from people who were DJs who had Bert on their shows. So you've got Jules Holland, Bob Harris. There's a vintage quote from John Peel. There's Lauren Laverne's in there. There's a number of broadcasters.
Mark Radcliffe, Stuart McCoy. And so they all you got in contact with all of these people.
Yes, that's right.
And so I see Mark Cooper is in there.
Yeah. So these people actually, I think it reflects the esteem with which Bert was held. That a lot of these people have. Not just giving you a line or two saying, he was a great guy.
No, there's just huge...
some people have written very substantial...
Jules Holland's written a number of pages. So these guys phoned you up, you had conversations
with Jules, funnily enough, Jules isn't an email guy. So with Jules, it's a case of phoning him up and chatting, and I typed it up and sent it back to his PA via email, and it was all fine. With other people, Mark Cooper, who gave a very substantial...
Mark Cooper is a fantastic music producer of long-standing.
Indeed,
for BBC.
Yes, so Mark was producing later on the three occasions actually that Bert was on it. One with Pentangle reformed and two solo. But he was also persuaded by Bert's late wife Lauren and by Serena Cross, another producer at BBC 4, to commit BBC 4 to an hour-long 60th birthday concert with Bert. So Mark was also, by chance, Mark is also a Bert Jansch fan who goes back to the late 60s. So he would have been aware of Bert as a fan, but of course as a TV professional he had to be persuaded that this is justifiable.
Yes, people will watch
this is justifiable as an hour of TV time or whatever. And so that's quite interesting. But
I think as well through the Johnny Marr, I think a lot of people discover his music through the fact that people like Johnny Marr, very influential guitarists, hold him as a great influence on their playing.
Yes, or the Jimmy Page connection from the 60s, which people go on about. And look. Bert said something interesting to me once. He's a very, very humble man, not the sort of man to talk himself up in any way, but he had a man of few words, but he had a great self-awareness. And I can't remember the context, but at one point, I think maybe I'd said to him, I see so-and-so's mentioned you as an influence recently. And he said, the thing is, Colin, if you're interested in guitar playing, at some point you'll find me. Which I think is quite...
So he knew that...
He knew the worth of what he was doing, but he was the last person to push it out there. Yeah. That's the interesting thing. Yeah. Absolutely no ego, no marketing drive whatsoever. So he
but he knew that he deserved a place in the development of guitar playing.
It's why
he knew that he was in there and that he was influencing.
I mean, his
people.
career had tremendous ups and downs. For example, in this particular BBC set, there's a gap in the 70s that's only partly because a couple of sessions were missing from 71 and 73.
Mm-hmm.
But apart from that, he was virtually not on the BBC between
that's
between
so strange,
71 and 80.
And that's just the nature of the changing tastes in music and what was,
Well, but the interesting thing is he was signed to Charisma during that period of time, and Charisma was kind of a big hitter,
so he should have been
cred
more,
label at that time, and he wasn't. I know that Charisma were trying to get him on the Old Grey Whistle test, but for some reason they didn't want him. So so what we have from the 70s basically is 25 minutes from Cambridge Festival 1977, which I think it's a shame. I mean, people seem to like that recording, and it's fine, but I think in a way his career had gone a little off the boil at that point. If they'd caught him in 1974, as Radio Clyde did, amazingly, one of the very first commercial stations, Radio Clyde, recorded him in Glasgow in 1974, and that came out as the River Sessions 10 years ago or so. I mean, that in a way, there's a rare example of commercial radio doing what the BBC should have been doing, capturing an artist who was on fire at that point. But these kind of ups and downs are kind of part of the story.
Yeah, and I do remember in the mastering that a lot of it came from. It came from so many different sources. You were finding yourself all over the place.
Yeah, the bottom of the sea, you kept saying.
And but there are lots of radio appearances with presenters who are very much of the smashy and nicey kind of they sounded like from the 1940s,
and that was Bert Jansch.
Bert Jansch.
Here's one from Captain and Sneal.
There's lots of that, which would turn my stomach. But sometimes we would leave it in if the context was right. But there was a lot of just noisings of presenters.
Actually, one of the funniest ones was for me. A lot of that is great context. As long as it's relevant. To
not when you hear it 50 times whenever you're reading.
Fair enough. But I think there was one that we didn't use because we had a different broadcast with a different presenter of the same track. But there was a great one from Late Night Radio 2 in the 80s where there was a man saying at the end of a track, and that was... And there was a pause, and you could just sort of see him kind of looking for the Bert Jansch. Look, who was that? So
there were a few people phoning it in, maybe not, at the time. So
listen, it's part of the history of the BBC as well. That style of presentation, and I write a history of the BBC session as a thing at the start of the booklet there, because a lot of people, particularly on the Steve Hoffman forums in America, which is a forum for people who are interested in music, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what a BBC session is, or the nature of how these things originated.
The Hoffman forum's not a forum for people to take apart the people who put put these things together.
Oh yeah, no. Even as we speak, there'll be conspiracies there to find out where you live and put you out of business.
Yeah, send round hearing aids to the house and stuff like this.
No, look, the world, the internet has made sure that everyone who has an opinion can air it. And
but look, I look on the box sets here. I'm just looking. It is really good the way it's all laid out. You can see exactly what show, so Tom Robinson or the Celtic Connections, Mark Radcliffe, Folk Britannia, Liz Kershaw's show. It's all let out for people, so it's really nice that you know exactly where it came from. Bob Harris Radio 2 show, Gloria Honeyford. Bert Jansch, that's a bit unexpected.
Well, worse than that, it was Lorraine Kelly sitting in for Gloria Honeyford that day. So really,
bring back Gloria Honeyford.
Yeah, it really couldn't get more bourgeois. Actually, to be fair to Lorraine, I included with some of these people. I've included small bits of interview from longer interviews just to give a feeling of where Bert was at that time, or how he was perceived by the corporation. And to be fair to Lorraine Kelly, she knows Bert's music,
So she was a fan.
Yeah, from listening to the whole of the interview, which is only excerpted in the set. Yeah. She does know his music,
Yeah, there are quite I remember we did leave in a few interviews, didn't we?
Little bits, snippets. That kind of give a flavour. Obviously, nothing.
And he
that
wasn't
says,
very talkative, but he wasn't a cold interviewee either. But I think it'd be safe to say that he really liked to speak through his guitar playing.
Yeah, I think so. I think he was. I mean, Bob Harris was quite good with Bert as an interviewer because Bob.
Russell Harty.
Yes, because Bob would know that Bert wasn't an effusive character, so Bob wasn't afraid of leaving a bit of silence to get a response. Actually, I don't know if we kept this in. There was a funny bit where Lorraine Kelly asks Bert, or they've just played a track, and Lorraine says at the end of it, "Oh, that's a bit that's not like your usual kind of song, is it, Bert?" And there's a pause, and Bert says, "No."
Well, she got the answer she asked for.
Yeah. I suppose that's what radio people shouldn't do. Ask questions that can be answered by yes or no. But no, no. As I say, Lorraine clearly knew Bert's music, and that's kind of interesting in itself. And actually, you know what? In later days, most of the people who had Bert on Radio 6, BBC 6, did know his music. Were fans. The likes of Stuart McConey. And Tom Robinson, I'm not sure. I didn't hear an interview from that show. I'm sure Tom Robinson knew his music. Radcliffe definitely, Mark Radcliffe definitely. Actually, there was one session there, Janice Long. I didn't have any of the Janice Long interview material, but I was told by Bert's publicist at the time that Janice didn't really know Bert's music, and she was blown away by his playing in the studio, which is nice to hear.
So when do you think the reassessment? I mean, like every artist has, the period in their life when you're hot, and the scene is with you and stuff and all, and then things move on, whatever. But then always comes the period of reassessment, and Bert Jansch is now a revered part of the British kind of canon of guitarists, and when do you think that really started to come? It was always bubbling under there with music fans, with he was. But I think now people are rediscovering him again.
Well, no, I think his position is secure really now. I think there was a time. I mean, in the middle '60s, he was as cool as you can get.
Yeah.
He was really at the cutting edge of something, and the BBC only had him on for the first time in December 1966, and amazingly that session survives as a master tape. So the BBC were quite cautious about getting the likes of Bert on, and actually that's not strictly true. The very first time he was heard on BBC was actually in a documentary in 1965, a TV documentary about a social worker in Soho called Judith Piepi, and she worked with a lot of down and outs and drug users and so on. And as part of this documentary, she visited a folk club. Now, alas, Bert wasn't on stage at that time. They got clips of Jackson Frank and Al Stewart in that, as verite in that. But what they did do in the documentary was show quite a visceral scene of somebody shooting up heroin in a basement. And they played the whole of a track by Bert called Needle of Death.
Right.
About a friend who died of a heroin overdose.
Right, okay.
And they showed a still of Bert's face and played this track. And so this was pretty visceral stuff, but that would have been the first time, in a way, that was Bert's first appearance on the BBC, even though he wasn't, bar a still, he wasn't in that. But yeah, by the time Radio 1 started, there was quite a lot of catching up going on, and Bert's band, the Pentangle, were featured on John Peel's show, I think something like 5 times within a year.
Yeah. And
we've used we weren't allowed to use Pentangle tracks because the Bert's estate wanted to keep those things separate.
Yeah,
and I understand that. I get that. It wouldn't have been my choice, but I understand why they wanted that to happen, and within those parameters, that was fine. We worked on this, but it just meant we had a lot of work to do to fill in, to give a flavour of at least something Bert was doing in the 60s, because we only had the one solo session from 66, and then we had little bits of solo and duo things that Bert did within Pentangle sessions. So so in a way, Bert's period of greatest influence is relatively sparsely represented, and then again, 1974, he had a tremendous comeback with an album called LA Turnaround and Charisma, and for whatever reason the BBC didn't want him at that time, and then we jump funnily enough, there's actually quite a lot of stuff from the 80s, which were a bit of a doldrums creatively for Bert. But for some reason, there was a lot of old folkies who were getting late night sessions on Radio 2 at that time, and sessions on Jim Lloyd's Folk on 2 programme. So there's a relative wealth of material from the 80s when Bert was commercially in his doldrums.
Yeah, maybe was that whenever some of the DJs were from Radio 1 were moving on to Radio 2 and things.
I think actually that was a little before that. I think Radio 2 was still very much the pipe and slipper scene in those days. But Jim Lloyd's Folk on 2 programme in mid-evening, it was a 2-hour show in those days, and there was still at that time something called needle time in operation, whereby the BBC still had an obligation to fill a certain amount of airtime with sessions. This is a musicians' union deal that was struck in the 30s or 40s, I think, whereby the BBC had to provide a certain amount of airtime that was using musicians recording specifically for those shows. Yeah. And that was huge in the 60s. I mean, a colossal amount of airtime had to be especially recorded. And then it ended in 1988, that needle time arrangement, and by that time, of course, it had diminished in the amount of airtime that was required. But I think that still allowed the likes of those 12 o'clock to 3 a.m. shows on Radio 2 to have to fill a certain amount of the time with old folkies. And because these are the people who could come in and put down half an hour of material. So that's where the 80s stuff was. I do remember on whenever we were looking through mastering about it's the strength of his performance. You could see over time throughout his career where he was holding it together, and at times whenever he was on fire, and that I think is represented in some of these recordings as well. Yeah, there are some. It's funny. I mean, there are times when his technique is flawless in these, and then you can tell there are times whenever it's a gig. Yeah, I think he would always do his best at any given time, but there were times when he was. The late 80s was the time when he, had a number of health issues, and he gave up drinking at that time as well. And so this does chart, chart the ebb and flow of his career to an extent. I mean, there's nothing that you'd say was a really dud performance. No, but it's funny. But there are others that are on fire. But his technique his technique and his sound are so particular to him and so unusual, and actually quite, it's quite complex what he does. It's very loose as well what he does. So there's always such a spiky guitar sound. Yeah, so nothing is ever quote unquote perfect. No, but it's all got character, and it's all an adventure, and it draws you in, and it's exciting. And which was the track? There was a track I really loved, which was a kind of almost very baroque kind of sounding track. Was it? Oh gosh, there was a few things. Incredibly intricate guitar playing. Whenever he was at his absolutely height. I think it's quite early, isn't it? Yeah, that's maybe one that was on Night Ride, John Peel's Night Ride, called Thames Lighterman. Yeah, he never recorded that in that version, but he reworked it as a track called Peregrinations on Rosemary Lane, his 1971. But it's incredibly intricate guitar playing, finger work, and use of rhythm. And I remember really enjoying that. Actually, thinking, how did he do it and get that sound? Yeah, well, actually, on that score, the holy grail of missing sessions that we didn't find for this was a 1971 Sounds of the 70s appearance with Bob Harris, where his album Rosemary Lane had just come out, and apart from one concert at the Festival Hall, a solo concert, he never performed most of that material ever again. He revisited a couple of things in the 90s and onwards, but by and large that album only exists as that album, and the Festival Hall performance, which thankfully was recorded by a fan from the front row. But the BBC, the Sounds on the 70s session, which features 5 or 6 of those songs, is kind of the holy grail for Jansch fans. And happily, a fan, Chris Gardner, got in touch recently to say he'd found his copy. Really? Yeah. So there you go. Yeah, he kind of thought he had it during the period that we were working at this. Yeah, and undiscovered. He thought he had it, but he couldn't find it in time for this. So I think we will be, given that there's no real option for that to come out, that will probably be something that's shared on YouTube, because it's probably not a great quality recording, being an off-air from 55 years ago or whatever. But yeah,
Well, I'm sure there's still a lot of
deserves to be
people want to
heard.
hear that.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is so there are 8 discs
Yeah.
in this collection, and you have a choice between
The
this
vinyl version.
the vinyl version or the CD version. It's a beautiful hardback collection with lots of fantastic research by Colin as usual.
I have to say, Alex at Earth, who is a lovely chap, it's a beautiful design. It's very clean. And the paper is beautiful paper.
Well, it's all
stock.
very well considered and presented. So, where can people get this, Colin?
Well, this one should be available from pretty much any retailer online. Certainly Amazon. I think it's also available.
I went into
from
Boots the other day and I couldn't get it.
Yeah. I think it's also available on.
I'll check on Summers.
Possibly not. No,
Okay.
possibly not. I should say, actually, before we finish, that even though the plan was not to feature any Pentangle material on the Bert Jansch at the BBC set, to keep that entirely separate, I was very happy that within the last few months an opportunity came around to use some of the 80s and early 90s Pentangle BBC sessions on this box set for Cherry Red Records, which is a box set featuring the reunited Pentangle, featuring Bert and Jackie McShee and a revolving cast of people. They made some albums between 1984 and 1995. Those albums are in there, along with the best of the surviving BBC material that they recorded in the 80s and 90s, and some other tracks. So it was good that was used, because I was a little frustrated that material wasn't able to appear in this set. But it gets used eventually.
And so, do you think then you mentioned that you're going to be working on another Bert Jansch?
No. I think my time working on Bert projects is done. Cherry Red have.
He said that in about 2006.
Yeah, he did, and he got thrown back in. No, I think they're. Look, with any band of individuals, there are different opinions.
But there's still more music out there. Never mind whatever politics. There's always politics in every project.
I think that's what I was saying. There are politics in every project.
It doesn't matter what it is. But that
I'm
aside,
a facilitator, and when it
but is there more music? Is there more music out there? Is what I would.
Yes. This.
Maybe with the fall of the
Roman Empire,
with the Russian government, wherever they may find in some nuclear air raid shelters or whatever over there, if Putin's time comes to an end, they'll find another unreleased cache.
Yes. No, it'll probably be an unseen episode of Doctor Who from the 60s. That's what usually turns up in bunkers, isn't it? In failed states. No, aside from this this very nice box set, I have to say, of the 84 to 95 Pentangle albums plus BBC extras and so on. The Cherry Red have a template from me to do a similar box set involving the original band reunions in 1982 and from 2007 to 2011. And there's quite a lot of BBC material representing those, and a really nice soundboard from 1982. So there is potential. I've drafted a box set involving a DVD, gathering up pretty much all the band's surviving BBC appearances from the original era.
All of the surviving to be stuff.
I know. So a DVD and the reunion recordings from 82 and 2007 to 11 was the band's original albums from 68 to 72, plus various outtakes and so on. Lots of other people did the booklet. I just supplied some audio and gave them the template of the thing, and others ran with it, and it was great. I'm told that set just keeps on selling, so there is a demand, and it's beautiful music. It's great music. For me, there's a fair amount of politics, and I feel that as a fan, I have done what I can as a fan who understands, who is able to find stuff, who understands how the business works, who, it's all for history. It's all for history. I mean, the Jansch box set was this is me doing what I can for Bert's legacy, because I know that there was stuff in this that probably only I could find, or had. In some cases, it was stuff that I literally had that I wasn't aware that anybody else had. Broadcasts from the 80s or whatever. Stuff that I'd tape myself.
And did you just always tape? I mean, you're a natural archivist, obviously.
Yeah.
And but you've always taped. When did you start taping things?
My loft would testify to that. I think probably back in the 80s, and there was quite a tape trading scene in the 80s among fans of genres like folk music and so on. So yeah, you end up with copies of things that, in the digital age, it's actually harder to find original cassettes. Sometimes
there are a lot of there's a lot of music. There are a lot of bands around Belfast as well who didn't even know of music they had written and recorded or performed, and you managed to find it all. So
until I stuck it on YouTube.
Exactly.
Would there be any of those in this room, Cormac?
But you've there is stuff.
Cormac, I'm sure I've uploaded at least half a dozen TV appearances you were on in the 90s that you either A, had forgotten about, or B, didn't have a copy of.
And the same for many, many other bands around Belfast, So you've always been archiving, and
the trouble is, Cormac, this is more of a curse than a blessing. You think in the historical I think in the historical present, most people can just enjoy the moment. I'm kind of thinking, this might be legendary. I better make sure there's a copy of it. Really, seriously, that is sometimes what I think. And it's a real pain.
Well, a lot of stuff would be lost if you didn't. Anyway,
thankfully, I'm not alone. I mean, I should just finally point out that there's one. Hats off to a former BBC Scotland producer called Sean Purser, who alone in the world kept a copy of Bert's of a concert in Edinburgh he produced for BBC Scotland in 2006, or sorry, 2004 I should say, at the Queen's Hall in Edinburgh. 2.25 hours of prime. Bert
and nobody
Jansch.
else had it.
Nobody else. The BBC Scotland hadn't kept a copy.
Wow.
It had never made it to the National BBC archive, and that's within the digital era. So by and large, the BBC keep things in the digital era by and large, but occasionally things fall back behind the sofa, and it can be really, really useful if producers keep things. Actually, that's why we have the copy of Bert's very first session on Guitar Club, presented by Ken Sikora, a man who genuinely did do radio shows in his pipe and slippers. We have that because the producer, Bernie Andrews, took it upon himself to keep a copy, and he did the same with many of the Beatles sessions as well, which is the only reason they survive. So Bernie Andrews is long gone, but happily I know the chap who bought his archive.
And you're I know you're active on various forums, however. So there are, where do people who are archivists of music, where do you congregate online to trade all of this stuff?
Well, there are one or two private groups of people who are enthusiasts for this kind of thing, and I'm by no means in all of them, at all. I mean, I just.
But there are always people searching and putting out requests for stuff and finding out. And
I have actually worked. So
there's an element of investigation in it, isn't there? That people
there's
enjoy.
A fair amount of Sherlocking about this stuff. I mean, the last 18 months or 2 years, I seem to have been involved in quite a lot of these so and so at the BBC sets. And you find that for various labels, that's actually at the moment I'm working on a 20-disc Martin Carthy at the BBC for Madfish, which I'm very excited about. I mean, I think he's a superb artist, a national treasure really. And if I can do anything at all to promote that legacy, absolutely. But other sets that I've been involved in have been maybe smaller in scale but no less enjoyable. A 4-disc set of Stephen Grossman at the BBC, American bluesman who settled in England in the late 60s and moved around Europe and then went back to the States in 86. So there's a 68 to 86. There's a nice...
And the forums are useful for that stuff?
Yeah, you find that the BBC will have a certain amount of stuff, and then you will find that You know, actually, in that case, we got half an hour from BBC Radio Ulster of a show that I was at in 1986.
Right.
Amazingly,
and they had kept it in 1986.
Amazingly, they had kept it.
Because
now,
I know
I happened to have an off air of it, but
of course,
I was missing 10 minutes of it.
But I mean,
you
know, all the TV stations. I mean, really, tape and things like that were quite expensive. Remember, as you know, got into recording studios as bands, they just used to record over. You know, your session would be recorded over after they got the master for the next year.
Even
and the
you,
BBC, but the BBC did this all the time as well. People just used to record over things when they were maybe they didn't have new tape or whatever. So it is, you know, a lot of the archivists are the reason that we have a lot of this stuff. Enthusiasts.
Indeed. Well, you tend to. I've tended to find the sort of work I've done with these at the BBC type sets. You tend to find that in the jazz world and the folk world, these are areas where people were really, they were, you know,
intensely interested, they were involved in it. If they weren't casual to the scene, they were really, it was their life.
And also, back in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, there really only were 2 or 3 hours a week of these genres on the radio at any one time. So, you know, if you were a jazz fan or a folk fan, you kind of knew the time that you needed to be, you know, at your cassette machine with
bizarrely, I'm totally your
you know?
archivist, but obviously, you know, we run and you've helped in the start of the Scots Jazz Club Belfast. We now are sitting on an archive of about 80 concerts, so I've become as bad as you know.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, it's quite funny. I mean, as you were talking about keeping stuff and wiping stuff and so on, I mean, there have been times, have there not, Cormac, when I've come to you and said, Cormac, you have that thing we did 5 years ago? And you go, 5 years ago? Of course not. I've changed my computer 6 times since then.
I know.
But actually, so yes, to finish that story, yes, the jazz and folk worlds in Britain have been worlds that have been quite vexatious in keeping stuff.
People thought a lot. The music was important to them.
Yeah.
They thought the music was important for others to hear, and so fortunately, because of that,
whether or not it is, I'm going to put it in a box and.
Well, I think it is. Anyway, so there you go. So we'll finish off on that. So that's the Bert Jansch at the BBC, the end of another long project, which I hope people are into. It seems to be Bert Jansch's ever increasing reputation as an important guitarist.
And you know, Earth Records have an ongoing relationship with the estate and will undoubtedly be you know, releasing an album or two a year of, you know, repressed vintage albums or you know, the odd concert. You know, so that can go on for any amount of time. Really, the well is not empty. The BBC well is empty for Bert, which is nice in that is a definitive product. Apart from the 1971 session. But there's always something, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there you go. Thanks very much for coming in and
thank you.
Unleashing.
And thank you, Cormac, for your superb mastering work on it, which we didn't really talk in detail about your restoration and mastering.
Oh well, the nuts and bolts behind the scenes of the
there were
down in the entertainment minds, you know.
A lot of extra miles gone. Yeah.
Anyway, there you go. Bert Jansch live at the BBC. It's CD box set.